welcome everyone. My name's Clare Farrell. I'm one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion, and I'm here with Dr. Charlie Gardner, who's a conservation scientist, part of Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. And we're going to have a conversation about what's happened at COP27. We did some similar videos in the past, which were about the IPCC reports and just trying to interpret them and explain what they mean, and we thought we'd do the same again for the COP. And as we booked in the timing for this, we didn't realise that the talks were going to run over, so I think they've only finished about 4 hours ago. So timing's hopefully good. Welcome, Charlie.
Thanks, Claire. Nice to be back with you.
So let's just start very basic. What is COP27?
Well, it's the global negotiations between the countries of the world about how we are going to address climate change. So the full title is the 27th meeting of the Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the UNFCCC is this big piece of international legislation, and there are 194 countries that have signed up to it. So those are the conferences of the parties, and since it was created in 1992, this is the 27th time that the governments of the world have come together to meet, and as we'll see, still haven't managed to make much in the way of concrete agreements to addressing climate change. So that in itself is a huge indictment. The fact that we know this is an emergency, we know this is one of the most, the most important thing we have to address, and yet this is the 27th time they've had to get together, and they're still not there yet.
This year it was held in Egypt, and there was a lot of talk about the human rights issues. Everybody in our movement, I know, will understand that, like, climate justice, human rights, all part of the same picture, but what was the sort of story on holding a conference like this in Egypt?
Well, I think a lot of activists, a lot of human rights activists and people from the global south are very disappointed that it was held in a country with such a poor human rights record. It's a bad starting point. But as well as that, there's been lots of fundamental problems with the involvement of fossil fuel industries, both as sponsors and as official delegates at the conference. This is a real problem because, as we know, the struggle against climate change fundamentally means we need to shut down the fossil fuel industries. We need to stop burning fossil fuels. So when you have the fossil fuel industries taking part in the process, obviously they don't want change. They don't want legislation that will stop them producing fossil fuels because that will limit their profits. And so this has been a real problem. The 18 of the 20 sponsors of this conference are linked to the fossil fuel industries in one way or the other. The biggest sponsor, ridiculously, is Coca-Cola, which is the world's largest plastic polluter. But the other sponsors include Egypt Air, an aviation company. They include a car company, General Motors. They include banks that are bankrolling climate change. They include companies that produce oil drilling equipment. It's just ridiculous. So this is a real problem. The other issue is that there are huge numbers of lobbyists, professional lobbyists from fossil fuel, from agribusiness and other industries that are working to prevent change. So, for example, Global Witness produced a report just last week that highlighted there are 636 fossil fuel lobbyists at this conference. There's a bigger delegation of fossil fuel lobbyists than there is an official delegation from every country. And this is just ridiculous, really, because this is supposed to be a forum for governments to negotiate amongst themselves, and yet those that have a vested interest in preventing the change we need have the biggest seat at the table. And I think there are some quite blurred lines between fossil fuel lobbyists and governments. For example, the chief executive of BP is attending this conference as an official delegate of Mauritania, which is, it's very dodgy on a number of levels. And we see that, we see the influence of the fossil fuel industry in the final outcomes, which favour the fossil fuel industries, as we'll talk about in a minute.
On your notes here, I've got Kevin Anderson calling it an increasingly corrupt and immoral process, and other people describing it as like a fossil fuel industry trade show.
Yeah, it's being called a festival of greenwashing, as you say, a trade show for these industries. Kevin Anderson is one of the UK's top climate scientists. He is an IPCC author, and he gets a lot of respect because he calls out these incompatibilities and these nonsensical arrangements with the UNFCCC. So some of the context around it, the way it's being held, the influence of these lobbyists, it means it's sort of fundamentally constrained. It's like they have their hands tied behind their back before they start negotiating because of the way the whole thing's set up.
So, I mean, a lot of people have said for a long time, haven't they, that it's not built to succeed and it's failed to deliver so far for so many years and doing the same thing again and again and expecting it to go differently, but this year increasing the number of fossil fuel lobbyists by 26% is clearly, if you need to change the conference, you need to change it in the opposite way to that, because the change that has happened is that the influence has got even more.
Absolutely, yeah.
So onto this negotiations, what's happened? Like, how has it gone overall? What's your impression?
Well, from what I can read about delegates sharing their insights on Twitter, and particularly delegates from the Global South, there's been a lot of mistrust. I heard it described as a dystopian COP, partly because of the influence of fossil fuels and partly because there's been this growing mistrust between the rich countries of the global north and those of the global south. It's the rich countries of the global north who have caused most of the problem historically, but it's those in the global south that are primarily suffering. They're on the front lines, suffering with all these disasters. And there's been this general sense throughout the conference that the rich countries don't care, essentially, about those in the global south. And this has created this atmosphere of mistrust. Throughout the 2 weeks, there was lots of blaming going on for failures in negotiations, and for a while it looked like the talks might collapse entirely without reaching agreement. Luckily that didn't happen, but it was a close call. So the meeting was scheduled to close on Friday night. The negotiations only finished, as you say, this morning on Sunday morning. In the end, the governments did agree an agreed text, but it's very, very disappointing on a number of levels.
It's been a long time, hasn't it, since since I first heard about representatives from island nations and from the global south walking into those negotiating rooms and saying extraordinary things like, you're asking us to sign a suicide pact. This is not a real negotiation. And so it's no surprise to look at, your 27 meetings down the line, and people are still trying to get away with, not admitting their culpability, not admitting that there's a sort of injustice or that there is like any reparatory damage to be dealt with, as well as, the fact that we're still not mitigating.
So that was actually one of the big positive outcome from this meeting, actually, is that there has been progress on this area, what you're talking about. It's called loss and damage. And in 1992, when the UNFCCC was first established, Vanuatu, the Pacific island of Vanuatu, was representing a coalition of small island states. And of course, small island states are some of the most vulnerable because they'll be completely wiped off the map by sea level rise. They will cease to exist. So in 1992, Vanuatu called for a fund for loss and damage, which basically said, it's the rich countries of the global north have caused this problem historically. We are paying the costs of it, and that's not fair. We need to be compensated for the loss and damage that you guys have caused. This was obviously quite an unpopular ask amongst the rich countries. The USA in particular and other industrialized countries were really reluctant to agree to this because it's an admission of culpability. Once you say, yes, we'll compensate you, then that means I admit that I'm to blame. And the USA was really wary of big legal and financial liabilities. So developing nations have been asking for this since 1992. It's never actually happened until this year. And last night, a fund for loss and damage was established. So this is fantastic. It's recognition of blame and culpability. But all they've agreed to do is establish this fund. So while it's a good start, they haven't committed any money to it. So it's been described as an empty bucket now. So the bucket's there, great, but we need to fill that bucket with cash. And this is a real problem because rich countries have made big commitments like this before, and they tend not to follow through.
Yeah.
So at COP15, which was in Copenhagen, rich countries, industrialized countries, agreed to a fund of $100 billion to help low-income countries decarbonize. But they never followed through and actually delivered that money. They made pledges, but they didn't actually give the money. So now we're in this situation where they haven't even given the money they've already promised. Now they're promising to give more, and it's positive words, but it won't actually count for anything until we actually cough up and pay that money, and there's no guarantees that's going to happen.
Yeah, and that reminds me of like the Paris Agreement, right? It's like you can get that agreement over the line so long as it's not legally binding. None of the rich countries will agree to be legally held accountable. The only way that you can get an agreement is if it's an agreement that you can blatantly break. So, bit of a problem there, isn't it? Despite the progress, if you could call it that, on loss and damage, there's a very big disappointment about the sort of no progress on emissions and fossil fuels, isn't there? So do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so there were 3 other main areas that were under the discussion. One was about limiting emissions that each country makes. So the Paris Agreement, which was part of the UN FCCC, was agreed at COP21, I believe it was, and this is the agreement that commits us to trying to keep to 1.5 degrees. And the IPCC shows that if we're going to have 50% chance of keeping heating to 1.5 degrees, then we need to reduce our emissions globally by 45% by 2030. And that's only 8 years away. So we need a huge, huge drop in our emissions. The way the Paris Agreement works is that each individual country, each of these 194 countries, makes a commitment as to how much they're going to reduce their own emissions every year. And at COP26 last year, which was in Glasgow, they agreed what they called a ratchet mechanism, which was a way of strengthening each country's contributions. They call them NDCs, nationally determined contributions. And with this ratchet mechanism, each country would have to tighten its NDC every year. And that was agreed in Glasgow last year. Unfortunately, that hasn't worked out this year. So of the 194 countries, only 29 of them have actually enhanced their commitments since last year, which is quite a big failure. Worse, there were some countries, including Saudi Arabia and Russia, that at COP27 this year, they tried to take out the ratchet mechanism that was created last year. And this would have been a disaster because this is the only thing we have to keep ensuring that emissions go down, and yet some countries wanted it taken out completely. In the end, it was kept in, but it's not an advance on COP26. It's just staying the same, and that's not good enough because it's an emergency and we have to advance. We need to be getting better and better and better. And as it stands, these national contributions just aren't good enough. The commitments that individual countries have made so far will see us increase emissions by 2030 by 16%, and yet we need to slash them in half. We need a 45% reduction, and yet the promises countries have made will see us increase, which is disastrous. So whilst we still have this agreement to limit heating to 1.5, we don't actually have any credible pathway to get there because it's not agreements that count. It's what countries are actually going to do, and few of them have made proper commitments to decarbonise themselves. So it's a real issue.
Yeah, and it's not just their contribution sort of commitments, is it? It's actually whether they do them, obviously, which is also a big problem. So that to do that, you need to phase out fossil fuels. So tell me about phasing out fossil fuels.
So ultimately, the problem is fossil fuels. 82% of all our emissions over the last few decades come from burning fossil fuels. So the one thing we have to do to reduce emissions is stop burning fossil fuels. So you would think that this is what the discussions in previous COPs have been about, and yet amazingly, no fossil fuel was ever mentioned in any COP text until last year in Glasgow at COP26. And last year there was this sentence which mentioned the need to phase down unabated coal. And this was problematic in several reasons. It didn't talk about phasing out fossil fuels, but just phasing them down. It didn't talk about all fossil fuels, but just coal. So it didn't mention oil and gas. And it also didn't say that we need to phase out coal. It said we need to phase out unabated coal. And it's not clear, it hasn't been defined what unabated means, but essentially the idea is that you could burn coal in a power station, but if you have some scrubbers in the chimney that will catch some of that carbon as it's going out, that counts as abated, so that will be allowed. But this is really problematic because there's no definition of what abated means. You know, if you're catching 10% of the carbon, does that count as abated? And obviously that would be a disaster if we carry on burning coal and catch small amounts of the emissions, but not all of it. So there was big hopes for this year. India and some other countries really wanted to transform the language. They wanted it to be phase out instead of phase down. They wanted it to be all fossil fuels instead of just coal. But unfortunately there was a lot of resistance from fossil fuel producing countries, Saudi Arabia, Russia, other Arab petrostates. So in the end, there has been no improvement on COP26 at all. The language still remains only about a phase down of unabated coal, and this, it just isn't good enough. The idea of that we've gone a whole year since COP26. You know, we only have 8 years left to reduce our emissions by 45%. This last year has been essentially wasted in terms of the COP process because there's no advance since last year. And a lot of the energy that's gone into these negotiations hasn't been about progressing it beyond the commitments made in COP26. It's been about just trying to stop the backsliding, trying to prevent countries that want to roll back on our commitments from last time. So I suppose you could say the good news is we haven't taken a step backwards, but we haven't taken a step forwards either. And in an emergency, not moving forwards is a disaster. So it's been very disappointing in terms of outcomes relating to fossil fuels. Yeah.
Well, and I remember, the outcome at Glasgow with Alok Sharma basically crying. And, that felt like there were significant elements of that were a failure. So, in terms of hosting this event in Egypt and all of the additional difficulties that's brought in terms of the framing, human rights elements and so on, it feels to me like the anticipated outcome from this, from some people anyway, was that it could go backwards. And then everyone goes, well, at least it didn't go backwards. And it's just not good enough, is it?
That's not a win. That's not a win.
So other agreements or things that have happened inside, was there other details, other things that people are sort of going to be terming a success? What are people going to hear about?
So all 194 countries have been working towards this one big agreement that they could all agree on, and we've got that. That's what we've discussed. But on top of that, there are lots of side negotiations between different groups of countries, and there's been some good news in that. So China and the USA have made an agreement to cooperate on decarbonisation, which might turn into something good. One thing that excited me was that the three biggest rainforest nations in the world, so the Democratic Republic of Congo, Indonesia and Brazil, which between them cover half of the world's rainforests, they've agreed to come together in a coalition of rainforest-rich countries to to protect their forests and to get the rest of the world, to get the rich countries to pay for this, because obviously global rainforests are a huge public good. We all need them, but it's unfair for rich countries to tell the Democratic Republic of Congo that it's not allowed to exploit its forest, because this is a valuable resource that the Democratic Republic of Congo could use for its economic development. So I think, and most people agree that it's absolutely fair for rich countries to help DRC and Indonesia and Brazil by paying them to help avoid that deforestation. So that's a big win for me. I think I'm quite excited about that. But again, this will only really count if the money ends up being delivered. There were some agreements on adaptation. And there were some proposals to make it harder for governments and other bodies to greenwash, to say that they are making progress if they're not actually doing so. And this has been a big problem. People like fossil fuel companies and others, they focus the public's attention on these tiny progressive things they're doing, and yet most of what they're doing is still pumping fossil fuels and promoting the expansion of the fossil fuel industry. So it's going to be harder for them to do that, which is also a very important move.
Yeah, I mean, it was quite exciting, wasn't it, recently to have some banks being, told on an official level, actually what you're doing is illegal. The things, the smoke and mirrors that you're trying to do with your PR, your campaigns, when actually the majority of your sort of investments are still going into making the situation worse. You can't then use these ad campaigns that make it look like you're sort of making all this progress. And similarly, I know someone called me the other day to just say there's a report just coming out about how Google has allowed fossil fuel companies to buy SEO to basically claim when you search the term sustainability, they rank really high. So that their bullshit basically comes up really quickly. And so there's a lot of kind of depth, isn't there, especially in our sort of current digital world, to be able to like shut down all of that sort of lying, really.
Yeah, because that's exactly what it is. It's lying. They are trying to deliberately pull the wool over the public's eyes to make people think that they have the problem under control, that they are working towards solutions. So don't worry, everybody. Keep calm, carry on. No needs cause a fuss because we are sorting it out. But they are not sorting it out. They are lying to us when they say that. So it's really important that stops and that these lies are exposed, because if there's one thing that we cannot afford to do, it's just keep calm and carry on.
And so here we've got a note about the UK expansion of fossil fuel licensing, and these quotes, Antonio Guterres, using bonus net zero pledges to cover up massive fossil fuel expansion is reprehensible. It is rank deception. And Greta describing it as a scam that provides a platform for greenwashing, lying and cheating.
This ultimately is what it's all about. It's not about the pledges and promises that governments make at COP. It's about what they do when they get back from COP and get back home and start governing in their own countries. Making a promise doesn't count for anything if you're not then going to implement policies that will allow you to reach that problem. So this is where the deception of our governments come in. So take the UK government, for example. The UK government was the first major industrialized country to set a decarbonisation target. They said we will reach net zero by 2050. And it's good that we have that target. But since doing that, they have doubled down on fossil fuels. We've had huge expansion of licensing for new fossil fuels, not just continuing to exploit our existing reserves in the North Sea, but searching for more. We've had government doubling down on road building, government giving licenses to new coal mines in the north of England, and the expansion of a coal mine in Wales. Expansion of airports. All of these things will lock us into more higher and higher emissions. And if you're going to expand roads and drill for more oil, then you're never going to be able to reach your decarbonisation targets. So it feels like we're being lied to. Oh yes, we'll reach net zero by 2050. but you're not trying. All you're doing is promoting more fossil fuels.
Well, and to make it worse, 2050 as a net zero target for the UK is frankly not good enough, is it? That's why we set up with our target of 2025 in 2018, which feels like a long time ago. But because if you don't have near-term targets, you don't do anything. So like a target that's 30 years away is completely, it doesn't do anything. It's not functional in political terms.
That's why it's so attractive in political terms, isn't it? Because you don't actually have to do anything. You're not going to be around in 5 years. Someone else can do the job. Someone else can do the difficult job of actually making it happen. And that's why a 2025 target or interim targets, as you say, are so, so important. But fundamentally, saying we'll reach net zero by 2050 is another way of saying we're going to carry on making the problem worse and worse and worse for another 28 years.
Yeah.
And it's just incredible. People are dying now. Places are being destroyed now. And the idea of continuing to make it worse is, you can't barely even contemplate how bad things might get if we're still burning fossil fuels and emitting as we approach 2050. We need to front load these changes now.
Just before the COP, there was big kind of what I felt was the first major admission that 1.5 is just not going to happen. You have that front page in The Economist, lots of people talking about 1.5 is dead. And I think people who've been paying close attention actually never thought it was a particularly credible target, even when it was written, right? Because you have so much work to do to decarbonise whole economies and to start to move in that direction. Nobody off the back of the Paris Agreement was prepared to do that kind of political work, that kind of work to transform the economy, that kind of work to have a real attention to the kind of system change that you would need, because the entire global economy is made of carbon, broadly speaking. And so with the kind of acknowledgement that there is no credible pathway to 1.5, or people having to say, well, we're not going to make that, and then knowing that we've got all of these complexities within the system, tipping points that we don't understand very well or can't predict with accuracy, at the same time as having everything tracking worst case scenarios and higher than ever emissions this year after this bounce back from all of the impacts of the pandemic. Do you think that there's a new potential in the space beyond the kind of pretense that 1.5 is going to happen? Because I feel like, at least in the circles I'm in, for a long time people have said there's a problem with this keep 1.5 alive rhetoric, when we know that when you look at the details, it's not alive. So talking about keeping it alive is very problematic, because it's a detachment from the truth, isn't it? And so...
Yeah, absolutely. You're dead right. We are not going to limit ourselves to 1.5 now. We've left it too late, and there's too much inertia in the system. And I think increasingly lots of very, very serious, credible analysts recognise this, that it's not going to happen. So I think it's important to be clear-headed and to be open and transparent about where we are. But there are dangers in that. So some countries at COP27 have tried to take out any mention of 1.5 from the agreement. And I think that's dangerous, because what we can't allow to happen is people to just say, all right, well, we've missed that, no worries, we'll hit 2. Because that's a failure to really acknowledge the reality of the issue. Missing 1.5 isn't just missing a political target. It means untold suffering and death for unimaginable numbers of people. It means huge amounts of destruction. It means billions and billions of pounds worth of infrastructure destroyed around the world. It means people dying. It means people hungry. This is an absolute disaster, and those that have led us to missing this should be held responsible for that. But while it is important to recognise that we're not going to hit 1.5, that doesn't mean that it's too late to act. All it means is that we have to make sure we don't hit 1.6. And if we reach that, we need to make sure that we don't hit 1.7. Every gram of greenhouse gases that is not emitted means less suffering and death. So no way does missing 1.5 mean we give up and just be satisfied with trying to get 2 degrees. But nevertheless, I think it's quite important that there is increasing recognition that we're not going to hit this target, and that's going to be really, really disastrous.
Yeah, I mean, that even just takes me back to the beginning of Extinction Rebellion, because just before we launched, there was a special report from the IPCC on the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And at that point, everyone was going, holy shit, this is a big difference, right? And people don't realise how big a difference it is. And so it's interesting, isn't it, to sort of remember the salience of that at that time to now, when people are going, oh, well, maybe we're going to miss it and we need to admit that. And it's like, I don't know, somehow the conversation feels less urgent in the sort of mainstream than it was a few years ago. Once you're in it, everyone sort of goes, well, we kind of need to be able to see a way through this, so let's not lose our shit, But actually, it's appropriate, isn't it, for people to be extremely alarmed about what's going on. And I think there's a major lack of sense of the watershed moment for humanity that it really is, for people to start to admit publicly, okay, we're not going to do that, because I think people have been clinging on to it. But so,
and well, just to say, of course, I think you're right there. But another thing to remember is that 1.5 should never have been a target that we want to achieve in the first place. It should have been something we need to avoid at all costs.
Yeah.
And yet we've just blown through it. So.
Yeah. Okay, so this is not a good picture. There hasn't been progress. We have explored some of the stuff around why actually the COP is designed to fail in many ways, and probably needs a very honest look at who's allowed in the room and why and how it all works. The next one is in Doha.
Yeah, it's in the United Arab Emirates, amazingly, a petrostate.
Yeah, and we know that they always get sponsored by fossil fuels anyway. So I think some people have been quite worried about what it would mean, basically, to just trash COP and say, it doesn't work, so it's just bollocks, let's do something else. Because the notion of relinquishing the possibility of any global cooperation is obviously terrifying and not okay. But I guess, knowing that we'd already had so many COPs and so much of this work had happened and not resulted in any downturn in emissions, when we started XR, we thought it was important to do the work of building social movements, building a rebellion within your own state, within your own country, where you do have political agency, and to engage in civil disobedience and non-violence work in order to sort of turbocharge the creation of the conditions in which change becomes more possible. A lot of people have said to me over the last few years, what XR's done, what Extinction Rebellion has been part of doing so far has been extremely important. You've obviously joined and taken part in direct action and been arrested and all of that kind of stuff. So do you want to just talk a little bit about why you took part in arrestable non-violent civil disobedience as a scientist?
Yes, I was actually at COP26 in Glasgow last year, and with a group called Extinction Rebellion, we carried out the first ever mass arrest of scientists. We blocked a bridge, 21 of us were arrested, and this is the first time scientists have been arrested en masse over this climate crisis. Obviously, we did this at COP26, so it's easy to sort of assume that our protest was against the delegates at COP26. But it wasn't. The reason we did it was to highlight the failures of COP26. I think a lot of people sort of don't realise how badly our governments have failed us. When you're young and growing up, you just sort of assume that governments are in charge and they're doing the right things, and what needs to happen is happening because governments are in charge. What this COP failure and the promotion of fossil fuels by the UK government, what they both show is that our governments do not have this situation under control at all. And that was what Scientist Rebellion were trying to get at with our mass arrest. We didn't do it to protest the delegates. We did it to show the public just how scared and desperate scientists are getting about these failures in the political process and how badly we've been let down by our governments. So I think for me, the most important lesson to learn from this COP is that we cannot rely on governments to do what needs to be done. And if we can't rely on governments, the only conclusion we can reach then is that we have to rely on ourselves. And we have to take action to make things happen for ourselves. And that's why I like you, I take part in civil disobedience, and why I'm such a strong believer in Extinction Rebellion and these other movements. Because it's an expression of people power. And I really think the only way we can turn this situation around is if enough people get up and make it clear that we will no longer accept these sorts of failures.
Yeah. And in terms of blocking a bridge, obviously, that was a disruption to the broader public. And I think having just watched the kind of other groups that have emerged in our field, if you like, Insulate Britain, closing a lot of roads, causing a lot of disruption, Just Stop Oil doing the same. People have had a big kind of debate recently about tactics and about disrupting ordinary people, in quotes. I love the way that sort of others, us, as if we're not ordinary people, for doing this kind of work. But it feels to me like, aside from the fact that conversation about strategies and tactics is often like a massive distraction, it's like a deflection technique that gets used by people in the mainstream media who actually just don't want to tackle the issue that we're trying to raise people's attention to. They rather sort of deflect and, sideline that very important conversation about the fact that we're, deciding to destroy civilized life on this planet on purpose. But there's something else, isn't there, about the nature of doing stuff that's disruptive. And I feel like the most beautiful kind of thing that I've heard someone say about it recently was a friend who basically said, if you see someone who's in mortal danger and you know that they don't know, you would tell them, wouldn't you? That's what you would do. And so is there anything that you think that's like a helpful reflection on why disobedience and why disruptive tactics?
So I really like what your friend said there. I really feel that. I feel, as a scientist, and just as someone that's read so much, I know all this stuff about what's happening and what's going to be happening, and I would never forgive myself if I didn't do everything I could to try and warn other people too. And I think, unfortunately, disruption seems to be an important element of that. People often say, why don't you take it to those that are driving the problem? And we have. Extinction Rebellion have, and Just Stop Oil have. We've had actions directly against fossil fuel companies. We've had actions that target airports used by private jets by the super wealthy. There've been lots of actions that directly target banks and those funding fossil fuels. But whenever we do those, the media don't care, and they don't cover it because they're not disruptive. And so the public don't hear about them. And I think that ultimately is the important element about disruption, is that nobody would listen to the fire alarm if it wasn't disruptive, would they?
Yeah.
So that's why it needs to be this way. And I've had really good examples of this in my own activism. Before I was arrested at COP26, I had made it be known that I intended to be. And I was invited on BBC Radio Scotland for a primetime interview in the morning. And they said to me, why do you want to get arrested? And it was precisely that. If I hadn't said I was going to get arrested, I would never have been invited on BBC Radio. They didn't invite me because I'm a scientist and they wanted to know about the science. They invited me because I planned to get arrested. And it's unfortunate that this is the way the media work. And so that's the tactics that we have to develop.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that, actually, because I worked in sustainability and fashion for a long time. And when we launched Extinction Rebellion, I was invited to a fashion conference to do like a headline speaking slot. And I was like, it's so ironic, isn't it, that like I was never going to get invited there to talk about upcycling techniques or how to industrialize, mass manufacturing of reclaimed materials in order to like make a more sustainable product, which I could talk to them about in our specialized field for a long time and have a really interesting conversation. But actually they were not really ever going to invite me to be on that stage until we started trying to shut down central London and do, audacious stuff like that. So what can people do to get involved? Because you're involved with Extinction Rebellion scientists. And so based on kind of what the scientific community have done so far in terms of joining movements and civil disobedience, what would be the routes in for anyone who's watching?
Well, there are global scientist movements as well as scientists for Extinction Rebellion, which is largely UK based at this stage. There's our sister movement, the Scientist Rebellion, which is operating in lots of different countries. If you are a scientist or have a background in sciences, I would urge you to get involved. Huge numbers of academics and scientists are just increasingly frustrated that the science is being completely ignored. Ultimately, what's the point of producing this knowledge if decision makers and those that have the power don't act on it, if they just ignore it? So that's why so many more scientists are getting involved.
It's also, in relation to what you're just saying, it's also important for people to know that there are community groups within XR which involve groups of lawyers, groups of psychotherapists, groups of healthcare workers, nurses, doctors. And there are particular benefits to having some of these professions represented, I think, in quite a public way. And you'll note recently that there were a group of doctors on trial who were acquitted in a very unusual turn of events in a magistrate's court. And quite often you see people either in scenarios where there's an action happening, the police actively avoid arresting the scientists that are wearing signs that says, I am a trained scientist and I think this is the right thing to do. The same with doctors, the same with priests, the same with rabbis, the same, you can look at these people who are held up as kind of, the respectable people in society, and when they come face to face with the police or with the judiciary, it's very valuable to the whole movement for people to understand, well, these people we respect, and they are also condoning this kind of action. So there must be something more to it than just whatever the media are painting as a picture. So I'll just close then by saying that we have got plans for next year to do a very intensive period of mobilising through the beginning of the year, from January and onwards into the spring, using some of the techniques that have been developed in the 3.5 campaign, which was trying to do mass mobilising techniques to get to 3.5% of the population engaged in the movement. We will be inviting people to sign up online so that we can see how many people are intending to show up. And I think we're already at somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 people who've pledged to come in the spring on the day when we go down to Westminster and show up in huge numbers. And part of what we're trying to do, I think, which is different to what XR's done in the past, is to try to build lots of connections and bridges between different groups. And right now, we are in a moment that I think is needs to be recognised for its kind of unique potential that's before us. The can't pay, won't pay kind of campaigning on energy bills information's been leaked basically that one of the big energy companies went to Kwasi Kwarteng and said if they did that campaign, even though they didn't get to 1 million sign-ups, if they even did it with less, they would destroy their business in a month. So, okay, proof people have this enormous power that we're actually not wielding through non-cooperation, which is what XR's set up to do. Also, the nature and conservation charities are livid about the tearing up of regulations in this country and about the raw sewage in our seas and our rivers, and you know we're in a big nature and biodiversity crisis, as everyone knows, but this country particularly is in a very, very poor state. So those people are organising a citizens' assembly, which you may not have heard about, an independent assembly to draw up a people's plan for nature. So this will be like a sortition selected, random, lottery-style selected group of citizens who are going to examine policies on nature, the environment, look at farming and so on. There's a whole load of different stuff they'll cover. And at the end, they'll put out something that says this is actually a democratic consultation with the public. This is what they want. So you have that, and then you also have like an energised trade union sector, including like a first of all time kind of scale of support for nurses to go on strike. We've seen lots from the RMT and other, unionised sectors. So it feels to me like if you put all of that in a big mixing pot with a very well organised climate movement that is good at doing non-violent civil disobedience and mass action, and everyone's pointing in the same direction, which is needing to deal with cost of living, deal with food prices, deal with climate, deal with biodiversity. I mean, it's all starting to seemingly, I think the dots are being joined up for us. So what's different to me about moving into the next phase of work is that it's an awful lot of bridge building that we're going to be trying to do at the start of next year, and connecting up with different groups and trying to show how all of our kind of struggles and all of our issues are connected so that we could build a much more broad base of people who are going to come together for social justice, for racial justice, for disability rights, for all the things that we know are like part of our, they're all part of our landscape of what we need to be addressing. And then demanding that citizens have an ability in the future to play a bigger part in politics by having deliberative democratic spaces that become capable of doing something different to what the ordinary setups can do. So, inviting everyone, if you aren't already part of Extinction Rebellion, to join your local group, sign up to the national action next year. If you're not in the UK, you can sign up to your local group or your national working group by going on rebellion.global and looking up to find local people to connect with there. Anything else you want to say, Charlie?
I think you're absolutely right. And it's not just in the UK, but people all over the world are increasingly angry with the way things are going, and increasingly realizing how connected these, all these different elements of suffering in our lives are. But of course, that anger alone doesn't lead to change. It only leads to change when you act on it and get out on the streets to put pressure on our leaders to do what needs to be done. So, I'm excited about the actions next year, and I hope you'll all join us on the streets, and I look forward to seeing you there.